Hello viewers, I am Dr. Vijaya from Osmania University. Today we are going to have a small discussion on John Milton's poem On His Blindness. Before going into the detail of the poem, let us first quickly look into the objectives of the lesson. The objectives are: number 1, to learn what a sonnet is. Number 2, to experience the poet's agony at the loss of his eyesight at a crucial moment in his life. Number 3, to understand poet's reconciliation. Number 4, to analyze the poet's faith in God. And lastly, number 5, to discuss the rhyme scheme of the poem. Before going into the details of the modules, let us first quickly sum up the summary of the poem. The summary: when Milton becomes blind, he begins to think about his fate. He feels very sad that he has become blind even before he could complete half of his life. He had hoped to write many poems, but blindness has denied him that chance. In agony and anger, Milton questions God. If he wanted Milton to use his talent of writing poetry, why did he take away his sight? After some time, the goddess of patience answers his question. She says, God doesn't want man's work or his gifts. People who accept God and his decisions willingly and cheerfully are the best servants of God. This is the brief sum up of the poem. Okay, for the sake of convenience, this particular lesson is divided into certain modules. Module number 1. Here in this module, we are going to discuss, or we briefly look into the biography of the writer, the poet, that is Milton. John Milton was born in 1608. His father was a prosperous merchant who had been disowned by his family when he converted himself from a Catholic to a Protestant. Milton excelled in school and went to study privately in his 20s and 30s. In 1638, he made a trip to Italy, studying in Florence, Siena and Rome, but felt obliged to return home upon the outbreak of the Civil War in England, perhaps in 1639. Upon his return from Italy, he began planning an epic poem, but his plans were delayed because of his marriage to Mary Powell and her subsequent desertion of him. In reaction to these events, Milton wrote a series of pamphlets calling for more leniencies in the church's position on divorce. His argument brought him both greater publicity and angry criticism from the religious establishment in England. When the Second Civil War ended in 1648, King Charles was dethroned and executed. And after him, Milton welcomed the new parliament and wrote pamphlets in its support. After serving for a few years in a civil position, he wants to take rest. Perhaps he wants to retire briefly at his home. Main reason for that is his eyesight was failing, and by 1652 he was completely blind. Perhaps it might be around the age of 44, and perhaps this sonnet on his blindness might have been written in 1652. In most of his poems, we come across his strong faith in God. Milton strongly believes that poetry should glorify God promote religious values, enlighten readers, and help people to become better Christians. A sonnet is a form of poetry that originated in Europe, mainly Italy. The term sonnet was derived from the Italian word sonetto, meaning little song or little sound. By 13th century, it signified itself as a poem of 14 lines that follows a strict rhyme scheme and a specific structure. The structure of a typical Italian sonnet is divided into two sections. The first 8-line stanza is called as an octave, and the second 6-line stanza is called a sestet. An octave is nothing but a doubt raising part, and sestet is a doubt answering part. The first one raises a question, and in the second part it proposes a resolution. And typically the 9th line is called a turn or volta, which signals the move for proposition or resolution. Even in the sonnets that strictly do not follow this structure, the 9th line, as we have discussed, the 9th line often marks a turn by signaling a change in a tone or mood of the poem. On His Blindness is a Petrarchan sonnet. As the Italian poet Petrarch, a Roman Catholic priest, popularized this sonnet form. The Petrarchan sonnet presents an argument, observation, question, or any other charge that is seen or that is presented in an octave. A turn or volta occurs between the 8th and the 9th line. That gives a foregoing discussion or what would be in the second part of the poem, that is in the sestet. This turn or shift in the direction of the foregoing argument turns the sestet, that is the second 6 lines, into the vehicle for counter argument, clarification, or whatever the answer the octave demands. Okay. And this Petrarchan sonnet has a rhyme scheme of ABBA, ABBA, CDE and CDE. In this module, we are going to discuss the first 4 lines of the poem, okay, 1 to 4 lines. And these 4 lines exclusively talk about the theme of limitation. Just for convenience sake, we have given that the phrase called the side heading. Okay, let us look into it. In the beginning of the sonnet, Milton thinks about how his light has been used even before he could complete half of his life. As a man without light, he lives in a world both in quotes dark and wide. That is from the poem. The first word of the poem, when, is a sort of questioning that gives us an idea of questioning. Most readers believe that the poem is clearly about Milton's blindness, but the poem directly never refers about his blindness or even vision. Light is used as a metaphor for vision. The metaphor is complicated, or Milton says that his light can be spent, and this word suggests that he is thinking something like an oil lamp. We know how the oil lamp works. The light is spent, again in quotes, the light is spent when the oil in the lamp runs out. The word spent perhaps also talks something about money, but in these 4 lines especially, Milton is reflecting on how he has used up or spent his vision. That's why I said the metaphor is complicated, right? Has he used it wisely, or did he waste it because he thought he would never become blind in future? However, light can most easily be interpreted as his ability to see. On the most superficial level, perhaps it is directly talking about his physical light, but as we saw in the biography in module 1, we also came across a point saying that he is a strong believer in God. And for this deeply religious poet, it may also mean an inner light, spent an inner light. This is what he is trying to say in these 4 lines. Milton also meditates on the devastating effect blindness has brought in his life. Not only in his life, but also in his work. He equates his lost vision with the light spent and laments that his limitations, because of his limitations, okay, because it imposes on his work as a poet. It is giving him some limitations. He is not able to acquire whatever he thought in his life. His poetic ability is so important to him that he calls that one talent in quotes, that one talent, suggesting it is the only talent that it matters for him. And he also says in the poetic phrase, it is lodged with me useless. Followed. He is saying that it is lodged with me useless. It is an expression showing about the limitation. He is particularly distressed about that, because Milton desires to write more and he wants to write more and more, okay? And blindness has imposed double limitation on him. Number 1, his limitation on the poetic activity, and number 2, he thought of writing, compiling an epic poem, and that also was not possible for him because of his blindness. That is the reason he says, in this dark world and wide. This is a typical word, typical way of how Milton was trying to use the adjectives, one before the noun and one after the noun. In this module, we are going to discuss on the key word which is frequently seen in this particular poem, and the key word is talent. The key word found in the first quatrain of the poem is talent, and the parable is taken from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25, verses 14 to 30. Of course, you know that it is from Bible. It is the parable of talents. In this famous parable, a man going on a journey summoned his slaves and entrusted his property to them. To one he gave 5 talents, perhaps that is 5,000 gold coins. To the second one he gave 2 talents, perhaps that is 2,000 gold coins. And the third one he gave 1 talent, and perhaps that is 1,000 gold coins, to each according to his ability. After the employer returns from the trip and asks for an accounting, the first one comes to him and says, "Sir, you have given me 5,000 gold coins and I have doubled the amount." And the second one says the same thing, "You have given me 2,000 gold coins and I have doubled it." But the third one says that, "I didn't do anything, I just buried it in the ground and I didn't increase its value." And for that, the employer denounces him for his laziness, takes that talent and gives the same talent to the one who has 10 and casts him out into the darkness. This is a parable taken from the Bible, and it has its own significance in this particular poem. The moral of the parable, of which Milton is well aware, is that each one of us, of course each one of us, are given gifts by God and that for all there will be a day of reckoning when all will have to present one's true account. In his poem, Milton plays upon the two meanings of the talent. Number one, a form of money in the Bible story, and number two, a God-given ability in everyday sense for each one of us. He fears that because of his blindness, he will never be able to put his talent to the use God intends. And for several years, Milton hid his talent in the earth. In the words of Gospel, the wicked and the slothful servant was cast into the darkness. One sense, therefore, in which it is death to hide one's talent is that one will be punished, cast out of light, out of God's presence. Milton, however, has not yet been called to give his true account. Perhaps his soul might be burning, his soul burns to make best use of his poetry. And this is where he is talking about the talent. This is where he is reflecting more on that particular word. He says, can God truly expect him to fulfill the duty that God himself has apparently made impossible? That's a question which raises in his mind frequently. In contrast to the above 4 lines, where there is a constant conflict of using his skills in the service of his maker, that is God, when he is face to face with God, he wants to have a record of accomplishment to show him. God is being compared to the Lord from the parable of talents. Okay. When God returns to him like the master in the parable, the poet wants to show that he has used his ability or his talents profitably, like the one in the first 5,000 gold coins. And the word account means both story, according to the Bible, and a record of activities with money. If the speaker turns out to have wasted his profits, he worries that God will scold him. We see the particular word chide in the poem. And if God is anything like the Lord from the parable, the speaker could get cast into the darkness. That is even more fearful than the one created by his blindness. And that's the reason Milton foolishly asks a question. He questions God for his blindness. And hence we see how in the following lines he humbly submits himself. That's the reason we see theme of submission. And patience, the virtue, counsels against the foolish question put to the Almighty. Patience answers Milton's question. She says, man's duty to God is not to give him anything. According to Milton, God has no need of humans' work. Everything they have is his own gifts. In the face of catastrophe like blindness, the only course of action open to him and the rest of mankind, as the last 6 lines of the poem says, it suggests the humble resignation to God's will. I quote, "Who best bear his mild yoke, they serve him best." It takes us back to the passage in John's Gospel, where Jesus tells his disciple that the blind man has become blind not because of his sin, but God wants to see, or God's manifestation must be observed in that blind man. Work of God should be made manifest in him. And like Job in the Bible, Milton also accepts his lot in his life as a part of greater plan. Some are meant for action. I quote, "Speed and post over the land and ocean without rest," but others who only stand and wait, whether as a servant awaiting his master's bidding or a laborer waiting to be hired to do God's will as well. Milton bows down in humble resignation or humble submission to the will of God. The tone of patience and humility has perfectly mingled with great dignity, of course. The poem is a human document, a revelation of the struggle in Milton's own soul. It starts with a note of regret, and then there is a mood of doubt and questioning, which however melts in the final attitude of complete resignation. The beauty and exaltation of moral feeling raises the poem to its great height. The poem is full of allusions to the Bible. The extreme simplicity of the language is its peculiar attractive. In this particular module, the poem is particularly built on a principle of balance and contrast. In the first 7.5 lines, the poet struggles with his despair over the fact that his blindness prevents him from serving God actively. The last 6.5 lines resolves the problem and alleviate the despair by discovering an alternative way of service to God, that is the passive way of submission and worship. In this way, the poem is built on the principle of balance. Followed. In terms of contrast, there are various angles in which the poem could be read. Firstly, there is a contrast of mood between an octave and a sestet. The poet's increasing despair is observed in the octave, and his peaceful submission is seen in sestet. That is the contrast of mood. Secondly, there is a contrast of theme between the first and second part of the poem. Active submission is discussed in the first part, and passive service is discussed in the second part of the poem. Thirdly, there is a contrast in focus. Self-centeredness is observed in the first part of the poem, that is in octave, and in the second part we see there is importance to God, and in the octave we constantly come across in several lines like I, my, showing self-centeredness. In few lines like line 1, 2, 4, 5 and 6, we see these words I, my, self-centeredness. And in the sestet, we see his, him, that shows his humble submission. Coming to the last module of the lesson, in this particular module, we are going to discuss the types of sonnets. Number 1, Italian or Petrarchan. Petrarchan, originally called Italian because the Italian poet Petrarch was a founder of that, and Spanish sonnets also generally follow this sonnet form, and some English sonneteers also use this form. Italian sonnet form consists of an octave, group of 8 lines, and a sestet, group of 6 lines, and in one of the following rhyme schemes. Number 1, ABBA, ABBA, CDE, CDE. Number 2, ABBA, ABBA, CCD, DEE. Number 3, ABBA, ABBA, CDC, D, E, E. These are the few rhyme schemes followed in the Italian sonnet type. Clear? Coming to the second type of sonnet, that is Spenserian sonnet. This form was created and pioneered by Sir Edmund Spenser. You know who he is, right? The famous author of The Fairy Queen. Okay. He followed this sonnet form in a sequence called the Amoriti. It is one of the more difficult sonnet forms because the rhyme scheme interlocks like AB, AB, BC, BC, CD, CD and EE. That is the reason we call it a bit difficult. Of course, that depends on how. Coming to the third type of sonnet is Shakespearean, or in other words English. This form is probably the most common form in English. And because the title says Shakespearean sonnet, Shakespeare did not invent the form, but his sonnets are probably the best known of this type. That is the reason we say Shakespearean sonnet. Okay. And a Shakespearean sonnet consists of 3 quatrains and a final couplet. The rhyme scheme is AB, AB, CD, CD, EF, EF and a couplet G, G. Coming to our own poem now, the rhyme scheme of Milton's poem. If we examine the rhyme scheme of the poem discussed, the first 8 lines of the poem has a rhyme scheme of ABBA, ABBA. For instance, the first 4 lines of the poem end with the following words. The words are like this: spent, wide, hide, bend. Therefore, the rhyme scheme ABBA. So, also the second 4 lines of the poem. I read the words for you: present, chide, denied, prevent. Present and prevent rhyme together, chide and denied rhyme together. Therefore, again the rhyme scheme ABBA. Clear? And that is about the octave, the first part of the poem. Coming to the second part of the poem is called, as we already know in a module, that it is a sestet, right? And let us see its rhyme scheme for the last words of each line. Okay. The last words I read for you for the sestet: need, best, state, speed, rest, wait. Just for clarification, the rhyming words are need, speed, best, rest, state, wait. There ends our lesson for today.